record on this computer.
How to keep this in background? Is there something like, okay, we'll try like this only.
Okay, so we've started recording. Okay, we go ahead. Good evening, my viewers, and welcome to Heartland Bengali. Ajke amader sange we have Aditya Chaturvedi, and a brief introduction about Aditya Chaturvedi is that he is a very old friend of mine. Facebook e dekha hoyechilo, and one of those rare guys that I've met a number of times, and I've liked each and every interaction with him. He's a voracious reader. He's an engineer by profession. Into a different trade এখন আছে, and he is an extremely voracious reader. There are things that he reads, and there are things that he shares which are most of the times are outlandish to us also. A very profound thinker, and one of those rare guys who I have often believed is politically slightly left of center, and yet we see a lot of agreement in across a lot of issues. So I'll start with Aditya, and this is something which we intend to turn into a series. तो इसमें क्या रहेगा? We are planning to keep it in a way that this would be a series of chats between me and Aditya, a series of Adda session between me and Aditya, where we would essentially cover a lot of things. So ajke what we are thinking of doing is we are thinking of starting this series, this chat, with the idea of the background of political history of India, an idea of how India came into being, what happened before, and things like that. So this discussion would be in a mix of Hindi and English for the benefit of a larger crowd. Unfortunately, this would not be in Bengali. However, I don't think this should stop my Bengali viewers from viewing it and sharing it. So please stay with us, and I would want to introduce Aditya to you. Aditya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for the very warm invitation and very generous introduction.
All right, good to catch up, and let's be informal.
After a long
time,
wait, I am actually coming on a podcast, so it's it's basically something after a very long time and something new for me.
Yeah, and let us keep it absolutely informally. हम लोग जैसे बातें करते हैं ना वैसे ही करते हैं, because a lot of people appreciate that. A lot of people want to
Right.
Though we don't have too much of viewership as of now, but then there is something, as I said, कि Bengali में ना क्या होता है, it will take a lot of time for people to develop, to build this kind of an awareness about global geopolitics.
Right.
So whatever, going back, whatever little viewers, whatever little guys that come to the show, there is a section of crowd that has this feeling in them that they would want to be a part of the interaction, the way we interact informally. Okay. तभी हम लोग बातें कर रहे थे about the political history of India.
Right.
Okay, this is one topic which is of your interest, and there are several other topics of our common interest which we would be exploring. तो शुरू करते हैं about the idea of India. Now, India as we understand, India as far as my little understanding of India goes, there are two ideas of India. One is India as a civilizational entity, as a civilizational state. Empire state, civilizational state, jaise bhi bole. Okay, which is the idea of Chandragupta Maurya, which is probably the idea of a Shivaji Maharaj. And another one is the India as a nation state, the idea of India as a nation state. So how do you want to go about it? तुम किसके बारे में पहले बात करना चाहोगे?
I think I would like to start from India. As we often hear the term idea of India. So this term idea of India, it got popularized, it gained traction as a post-independent construct, as a sort of concept that we inherited after the British rule, when the various princely states and regions, they were united, and they formed a country, an independent country. From the throes of colonial rule, an independent nation came into existence, but that is a very recent history, and that won't be doing justice to the idea of India as a civilization, as an ancient civilization, I would say, and as a country. Like, I would like to quote Hegel, the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who is reported to have said that India and China as they are and as they exist lie outside the course of world history. So this assumption, this notion that India is a recent construct, India is a modern construct, and this quote unquote idea of India, by the way, which was a good book written by Sunil Khilnani, is something that is as a result of British inheritance and the Indian and British cultural intercourse, their encounters with each other. So this led to the idea of India. This is a very recent iteration of that concept. The idea of India, if you look, even philosophers, leading philosophers, be it Hegel, be it Schopenhauer, be it Friedrich Nietzsche, they have written about ancient India, they have written about Indian religious texts, they have written about the history of Indian region. And India, the term itself, is basically, it connotes a geographical unit, land beyond the Indus, that is said to be of Persian origin, and that is also said to be what they call it Greek origin. So they knew the land beyond the Indus as a separate civilizational unit with its distinct cultural modes, with its distinct social attitudes, and with its distinct ways of life and living and of various other things, and its distinct philosophy. So it was basically we can say a medley of different beliefs, that people of different belief systems, they dwelled here. And religion as we know it today was like the categories that we have today, the hierarchies and the stratifications that we have today were absent back then. But yes, there was this idea of civilization, and as today we see, after at the end of this idea of nations without borders, of borderless liberalism, as it is taking a beating, so the concept of nation state, the concept of national sovereignty is rising up again. And people identify India, China, Russia, Iran as different old civilizational entities and different civilizational blocks. So the idea of India as a civilizational state, as an ancient civilization, predates the idea of India as something that was born, that didn't exist before the British came, and that was basically given a shape by British. And so it is something like, we say, post-colonialism. So post-colonialism was something we inherited. It was an inheritance, but there is much more to it. And as you see, there is something about this book by Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. So where Huntington failed was he basically postulated that two countries of the same, that belong to the same civilizational block, they cannot fight, they won't fight each other. So that is now like gone by his hypothesis. There shouldn't be a Russo-Ukrainian crisis, especially what we see in Donbass and eastern regions. But that's for another day. And another debunked theory, it ranks, but along with I think it was Friedman, that guy, the New York Times journalist, who said two countries who have a McDonald's, they won't fight with each other. But
Milton Friedman.
Yes, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman. But I think this guy, Huntington, he recognized India as a separate civilizational bloc, the Islamic world. And in the Islamic world also, he recognized the three main schisms: the Turks, the Sunni Arab Islamism, and the Shiite Iranian Islamism, along with the Oriental civilizational blocks. So I think this book is very remarkable, given that when we study the concept of civilizational states, and these days a lot of works are being churned out. So I think, if I'm not wrong, this was among the first books that laid down this concept of civilizational states, and how citizens and their governments, they have this civilizational imperative and the civilizational thrust upon them, and how they identify themselves accordingly. So this was a unique book in that regard, but it had its limitations, and it was also a product of its time, born out of the post-Soviet liberal triumphalism and the euphoria of those times.
Okay. So I have two questions here, two follow-up questions. So one is that, the idea of India as a civilization is the one that sort of, whatever I could understand from what you said, is that the idea of India as a nation state probably is new, probably is somewhere, created around the regions of 1930s and 40s, or maybe 10 years before that. But the very fact of idea of India as a civilizational state is something which is a much more solid, a much more grounded idea, which has been there since centuries. And that is the idea that sort of reinforces the idea of India as a nation state in today's world, where there is this, there's this madness amongst the progressive liberals, so-called liberals of the world, who want to break down every borders and all. So India as a nation state survives strong only because the idea of India as a civilization state. Is that what you want to say?
I would like to say that India, if we see India, then what differentiates India from the colonial world, from the other colonized countries, be it in Asia, be it in Africa, is that when India came under foreign rule, there was much cultural interaction and cultural engagement. And in part, it was in part what we say mutually synergistic association, especially in knowledge, in ideas. Just like the colonized countries elsewhere, the people here, the intellectuals here, they embraced Western ideas, they learned from the West, and the Western thinkers, they excavated India's past, they excavated learnings. Like Indian works, they were translated to languages. Even the Upanishads and the other religious scriptures, they were translated first to Persian and then to German and French and so on. So the idea of India, even if you see the idea of India, which the freedom fighters invoked, and the imagery that they conjured, even be it the freedom fighters for the leftist persuasion or the right wing or the nationalist, of all the broad umbrella of freedom fighters and nationalists, of Indian nationalists, they took this idea of India being a continuum, India being an old civilization. But I think what differentiates India from other civilizations like Russia or China, or we can say Iran, is that India has seen a lot of disruptions. China and in Russia, there were revolutions. Russia had a Bolshevik revolution. China had this Maoist revolution, this cultural Chinese Maoist takeover of power. But if we read deeply, we see that in Russia, the Bolshevik rulers, it was a discontinuity, it was a radical rupture. But in terms of statehood, in terms of statecraft, and in terms of the preservation of the Russian power and Russian prestige, it was a continuum. And even Stalin has went on record to say that whatever the Tsars did, the Tsardom did, they extended Russia's borders. And it is the task of the Soviet people to secure the Russian borders and the Russian frontiers. So basically, geographically, and in terms of a lot of, you see the Russian writers, the Soviet writers, that we see the books being sold on the pavements, they were writers of the Russian Empire, but they were promoted by the Soviet Union. So in a lot of ways, there was a continuum, there was a continuity. There was a rupture, that is true. There was a radical rupture, and it was basically things came to a juddering halt. But it was also a continuum. Similarly, in China, if we see other than Marxism and Leninism, or the Mao's own interpretation of Maoism, or later Deng's interpretation of market Leninism, or free market, opening up markets, or what is famously said, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white unless it turns mice, or basically the move towards markets and this pragmatic approach, weaning the country away from the turbulence of the Cultural Revolution. There is something called the Analects of Confucius, the Confucian belief system, the Confucianism, the Confucian emphasis on ethical values, on families. So this Confucianism is the anchor of Chinese civilization since the days of Mao, and since during the days of Deng, and even today during the days of Xi Jinping. So if there have been articles that Mao's writings, Mao's oratory, and Mao's exhortations, they were in the similar fashion to Confucius. They were in a new Confucian mold. And if we see this emphasis on Confucianism, or be it the emphasis on a long bureaucracy, of a very sturdy bureaucracy, they date back to maybe a few hundred years ago or a 500 years ago, to the days of Chinese emperors and kings. So all of these things, they were introduced. And also, if we look at what people say, this China's new Lone Ranger diplomacy. So it also, if we examine it historically, this Lone Ranger diplomacy and China being suddenly becoming a very aggressive actor and a very bellicose player, which is disregarding all the rules, all the covenants and everything that was established, and which is not being a responsible player. So it dates back to this, their perception of being besieged and their perception that they need to make a mark in this world. It is, if we look at the history of the, basically their humiliations at the hands of Western colonial powers.
Western colonialism, yeah.
Be it the Boxer Revolution or the British interference there or the Opium Wars.
Opium, yeah.
Yes, this is something I think they have internalized. And as one of your favorite philosophers, Zizek, as Slavoj Zizek, as he says, that the unique thing about China that bewilders everyone, be it the leftists or the liberals, is that it has managed the ultimate
combination,
what we can say, synergy of two antagonisms. So it was basically like Mao said, there was antagonisms, two antagonistic contradictions and non-antagonistic contradictions. So on one hand, you have the political structure, which is just like the Soviet structure and the old communist structure, that brooks no dissent, that allows for no political pluralism, no political parties, no civil society unions. On the other hand, there is the Western style economy, the Western style skyscrapers, consumer growth, fast building capitalism. So it is this marriage of Soviet style political system and the Western style economic system. And on top of that, they are basically, it's the role of their own committees, which is shepherding the state sector.
This is probably the best example of Hegelian, antithesis or thesis milke jo synthesis banate hain. This is probably the best example of Hegelian.
Best example in current days, and this is actually something.
I think this is the only example today we have. Isko chhod ke to example yaad bhi nahi aa raha hai.
Not on this grand scale. Like on a mini scale, there could be countries.
There could be.
This is why they say China and India and countries like, coming back to India, they defy classification.
इसमें मेरा एक सवाल है यार. इसमें मेरा एक सवाल है यार. You said that Confucianism is a bedrock of China, Chinese civilizational identity, and yes, I mean, I understand that. In the same way, when we talk about Russia and the fact that, yes, Russia had a revolution, but then it was internal. There was no external invasive forces. There was no prying open of borders and, foreign people settling in, whether you like it or not. It was Russian. So can I, in the way that Confucianism is the bedrock of Chinese civilization, can I say something like, or can I assume something like Russian identity is the bedrock of Russian civilization? Because if you look at, I'll tell you why. Because if you look at Lenin, who's from a tribal background, he identified himself as Russian. Stalin is a Georgian. He identified as a Russian. Catherine was a German. She identified as Russian. Konstantin Kaufmann was Austro-German. He identified as Russian. आज के दिन में ये Habib भी अपने को Russian बोलते हैं ना, Dagestani and Chechen people, and they actually mean it. If you look at this Ukraine war, and if you look at Kadyrov and his Chechen identity, I don't know, probably that might come back sometimes later, but as of today, his Russian identity is what triumphs everything. Okay, so has Russia been very successful in the same way? Okay, China, whether they have been successful in planting Confucianism or not voluntarily, I don't know. But has Russia been successful voluntarily or involuntarily been very successful in planting the idea of Russian identity? What holds that as a civilization? Quickly, usko tum soch ke batao. Fir let's come back to India. What do you think?
I would say, in terms of Russia, it has been a double-edged sword. Double-edged because it has been successful to the extent of the idea of Russia, which is very old. If you read, there is this book by Friedrich Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil. So he has written about Europe. He has written about the conflict between Europe and Russia in those days, in 19th century, towards the end of 19th century. So even in those days, there was this idea of Russia being a middle kingdom in the east, and that vast land that we do not know and that we are afraid of. And so there was always this dread, this perpetual threat of Russia, of this land of unknown. And like in the words of Nietzsche, I'll quote Nietzsche, like he said, that vast middle kingdom, nowhere in Europe, nowhere in our world, is the will to power and to persist more acute than in Russia. And if we look at Russian history, there has been this will to power and to persist, this persistence of bouncing back again. So Russia has followed a rather cyclic history. There have been destruction and construction, destruction and construction. So there hasn't been any like creative destruction. There has been like since the days of Mongol Khanates and then the Russian kings and then Ivan the Terrible to the Bolshevik wars to the collapse of 1991 to 1997 crisis and the utter kleptocracy and gangsterization of the Yeltsin days. So yeah, coming back to the original premise, I would say it has been a double-edged sword because the Russian identity was promoted and Russian identity was something that had a massive pull, that had a massive resonance. But at the same time, the same authorities they promoted, they engaged, encouraged, and they fostered subnationalisms and regional chauvinisms. So, as an example, the biggest irony I'll say is that Ukraine or be it all of these languages, they didn't exist. A lot of these languages, a lot of these scripts. So they were invented by the commissars, the cultural commissars of the Soviet Union. So these countries, they were given new languages, new identities, new libraries, new ways of thinking. So on one hand, they encourage this broad entity of Soviet, Russian, and also at the same time, they encourage regional chauvinisms. Like if you see modern day in Ukraine, all of these great writers, Russian Soviet writers who were basically who were from Ukraine, like Nikolai Gogol, I think was from Ukraine, from what is present day Ukraine. So they wrote in Russian mainly. And even this guy who is considered, is a poet, he's considered the founder, among the founding fathers of modern day Ukrainian nationalism, Taras Shevchenko. So he was imprisoned by the Tsars, he was taken to St. Petersburg, but he has written more in Russian than in Ukrainian. So this idea of, and this is where we come to, of inflaming subnationalisms, inflaming identity divisions, identity chauvinisms and regionalisms, even if for a constructive purpose, it backfires. Like it may not backfire one day, but it'll backfire someday. In the case of these identities, like Chechens, it's a very good example. And coming to Chechens and Dagestanis, they had their own identity even before, like even in the 1500s and 1600s. They are, I think, Turkic clans. So they are not really Russians. But they are more. They have accepted that they are a part of Russia. There are no identity issues there. So it is like there is this book by Tolstoy about this guy called Haji Murad. So if you look at Haji Murad was from Dagestan, from Chechnya or Dagestan. He fought against the Imperial Russian Army. It's a fictionalized novella, but there was a real guy also, I think, named Haji Murad.
Yeah, that was, I think, that was Shamil, I think. Shamil, yeah, Imam Shamil.
So this Haji Murad, he then changed sides and then he sided with the Russian army. And if you look at this eerie historic parallel with the father of Kadyarov, Akhmat Kadyarov, so the Kadyarovs have the same history as Haji Murad. The Kadyarovs started as separatists, as secessionists, and they waged war against the Russian army. But
and then they switched over.
Kingston, they switched over and then they become the most heartless and the most basically fierce Russian loyalists. Yeah. Now, what was the price? What were the hidden bargains? We are not getting into that. There were some other motivations.
But what's the cohesive factor? What's the cohesive factor? I mean, I know we are supposed to talk about India, but because this is a Adda session and it is going, and I'm loving it that it is going all across the place. What is that cohesive factor that provides that sense of Russian identity, which is sort of even aaj ke din mein bhi dekho, if you look at Putin's rating, I mean, there's nothing that the Western media has not done to sort of
absolutely
kill the image of Putin in the minds of Russian कि यार पुतिन भाग रहा है, पुतिन को कैंसर हो गया, पुतिन मर रहा है, पुतिन के पीछे ये है, वो coup हो रहा है, ये हो रहा है, फलाना हो रहा है, there are his own people are revolting against him, they'll shoot him, but his ratings are absolutely brilliant despite this 1 year war. So, what is it that holds this Russian civilization? Because as we discussed, and I'm sure a lot of people, because this is not in Bengali, this discussion is in English. I am
English and
hoping that
Hindi.
this would have, between the two of us, I'm hoping this would have a larger reach. What is that people would want to know? What if China has got a a bedrock of civilizational identity which holds Chinese identity together? If Russia has something, I'm sure India also has something. Either we haven't found it or India needs to have something, whichever way you put it. So can you make a guess as to what is that Russian thing which holds Russia together?
I think I am not a Russian expert. Like, I can only say from what I intuit, from what I believe, it's basically what they say, unity and camaraderie forced in hardship. If you see a Second World War, they call it the Great Patriotic War. And even today, there are the old memorabilia, the old flags, the veterans come, the parades are held, and it's a spectacle that is unparalleled in the world.
In
And
the world,
there
yeah.
is a very somber remembrance. Even people, even the youngsters, the young generation, they remember it, they hold it in reverence. So it's basically an abiding national myth, and it's a unifier of sorts that together we stood, and it is leading them. It is sort of like what they say. It is sort of a myth, but it is not myth in the sense like it's mythical. It was an experience of this Great Patriotic War, and so before that also there were invasions. This great European, what is called the European Russia. So there was this article by this guy in Financial Times. So he wrote this book called Prisoners of Geography. His name is Tim Marshall.
Tim
I think if
Marshall,
I
yeah.
get the Tim Marshall, yeah. So he wrote something like Russia attacking Ukraine, or Russia going into Ukraine after these. He wrote it from a NATO Western perspective, but he said, like, no, it is not paranoia. If you look at it, if you look at what their anxieties are and what they feel, their perceptions of threat, it is real. Because he gave an example, like if these area from Moscow to Paris, the European plain, there are no natural geographic formations except in a brief region in Smolensk in Russia and then in Poland. So if you start on a bicycle, you start on a car, you start on a bike, from Paris you will reach
the
Moscow.
same route that Napoleon took, actually.
Yes,
And he
yes.
could
And
march
there are
because it's like
no
flat land.
diversions.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a flat land. There are no diversions, no plateaus, and very little, you can say, where there could be entrenchments. So it is another thing I would say about this idea of what they say, a struggle in unity. It started, I think, during the days of this Mongol Golden Khanate, the Golden Horde.
Golden Horde.
Golden Horde, it basically wreaked a lot of destruction. A lot of it ravaged the entire Russian people. And after that, it started like there was this serfdom and there were various czars. So, but what happened was this idea of like there have been cyclic episodes of destruction and construction, as I said. History has been in episodes, but this constant theme of the country being at war and of people being ready to sacrifice, of being ready to be commandeered at the frontiers, this has been a common theme.
This is sort of united. This is sort of kept them united.
Other than that, it is the sense of being like, you see, a lot of these countries in Europe, especially in the Eastern Europe, especially in Central Europe, what you call Middle Europa, they were formed from the debris of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the Habsburg Empire. And a lot of countries in the East, like we see Bulgaria, Albania, they were under Ottoman rule previously. And other countries like Italy, they were not yet united. They were not yet unified. But Russia, as a nation, as a czardom, as a kingdom, whatever we call it, was there. It's like the borders were not fixed, because the frontiers kept on changing. But that was there. Another thing, it's very interesting. These days, there was this Hungarian left-wing writer who died recently. His name was, I think, G.M. Tamás. So he said something like the Russians, Soviets attempted to create the multiculturalism of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because in Soviet Union, there were people of all nationalities, of all different basically languages. So the last multicultural experiment that failed in Europe was the Habsburg Empire. Soviet Union, according to him, to an extent, attempted to recreate that sort of multiculturalism and shared living. And after that, the multiculturalism that we say today is nothing but a plain, what you say, imitation
हाँ,
of
वो
what.
आज का दिन का छोड़ है, आज का दिन का, I mean, let's not talk about the multiculti that Angela Merkel wanted to talk about. Let's stick to what Tamasa, let's stick to the idea of Soviet multiculti. तो इसमें मेरा भी थोड़ा सा ये है, I mean, yes, probably I may be wrong, but as I listen to you, this gives me an idea that probably yes, Soviet Union tried to create a kind of concept of multiculturalism, but was it multiculturalism in the truest sense, in the sense that, was it a kind of a East meets West kind of a confluence, which later on happened, which later on showed up for a very brief period of time during the 90s in the middle, in the Central European region, where, years and years of communist hangover, and then you were suddenly freshly, exposed to the ideas of the West, and there was this very vibrant clash of ideas, which led to those Viennese cafes, and the one that what's that guy's name? Timothy Garton Ash writes so a thing about, writes so heavily about, used to write so heavily about. So was that kind of the same kind of multiculturalism that Russia tried to experiment with? What do you think? But before that, let me also tell you, अपना 40 मिनट का हो रहा है. Okay, the end time is coming. So what we'll do is we'll stop this recording and we'll create a new recording and we'll continue. I guess you have the time?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. So let us stop this and we'll start with the idea of multiculturalism, or what you think about Russia and Europe, before we quickly come back to India, because ये India का history है यार. हम लोग को थोड़ा India लेके बात करना है. ठीक है? Okay, so I'll catch you up after, give me 5 minutes. I'll catch you up after that.
Sure.
Thanks, Adi.
Thank you.